As you know, the themes for today's event have come from a book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift. And I thought I would just very, very quickly pick out a couple of things that he says, which I think are really helpful in terms of reminding us about the themes for today. He talks about art as a gift and as an agent for transformation. And he explains that the initial creative impulse is something that needs to be worked on, and then it can be given to wake somebody else's imagination. Gifts, he says, have binding power. They bring individuals and communities together. Hyde also says, our gifts are not fully ours till they have been given away, which I think raises some really interesting questions about how engagement of all sorts feeds our own creativity. So these are some of the themes that we can explore throughout the day, which I think is about three things. It's about celebration. We've just had a really celebratory PowerPoint. I mean, that's fantastic. It's about celebration that really inspires us further in our work. It's also about connection making that widens that web of mutually supportive relationships. And it's also very much about collaboration and about making the best of that reciprocal generosity to create new opportunities. So what we have for you today is a keynote speech, we have provocations, and very importantly, we have time and space for you all as participants to populate the day with the exchange of your own creative gifts. And that is a key part of things. But to start us, to provide us with some more inspiration, I'm very pleased indeed to be able to welcome Professor Paul Robertson, founder of the Medici Quartet, visiting professor at the Peninsula Medical School, and joint CEO of the Music, Mind, Spirit Trust. And Paul will be talking about music as a universal hardwire creative resource that we have. Paul, thank you very much.
A delightful set of introductions, and what I'm going to seek to do, very briefly necessarily, is just indicate some possible terms of reference that you might find useful during the course of the day, and if I'm very fortunate, you might find useful from here on as something just to bear in mind. I'll just grab my violin. It's little understood at present. Indeed, it's little understood because it's been only recently explored as a potential topic that music may, and indeed I would argue must have, some evolutionary value. It can't be an accident that that when subject to all sorts of neurological breakdowns, including dementias, or when events of developmental nature don't take place, that pretty much without exception, musical response remains intact. And increasingly it's clear that a lot of the gifts that we quite rightly rejoice in and celebrate as human beings, particularly perhaps the very sophisticated gifts of verbal communication, actually stem from pre-verbal prosody and areas of the brain that are very much associated with and necessary to musical response. There's not the chance now to start going into the deep science because we'd be here a very long time, but that's the broad mention. Just to remind you that at 16 weeks, the fetus or unborn baby is responding to sound. By 26 weeks in utero, the infant will and does respond to specifically musical organization. And so I hope I'm going the right way. No, I'm not. This is not in any way what you might call hard science, but I'll just point out that in this fairly light-hearted experiment, one of the significant things is that the unborn child, the baby, is responding quite separately to the mother. It's very rare, and it's actually very hard and ordinarily to measure baby response when the child is in utero, because clearly the physiology is so tied up with mother's physiology and response at the same time. This is one of those rare exceptions. And so we see that the baby responding to music that only the baby's hearing, or we can see that in other circumstances. So I just alert you to that.
Okay. Let's see if this baby appreciates good music. Got a suspicion this baby's actually might have slowed its heart rate down slightly. Can you feel any movements?
No, afraid not.
No. Can you see the face there? It looks like now it's actually woken up. It's moving its arms around. And definitely some more movement. Looks like rock music has woken him up. Yeah, I don't think this one is phased by rock music at all. Probably prefers classical music. We can always try that. Okay. Yeah, the heart rate has actually slowed down a bit more now than with the rock music. There has been definitely a change since we've started the scan.
Well, as I say, I don't present that as what you might call a serious piece of conclusive proof, but there is actually a good deal of what you might call much firmer scientific evidence now which supports the case that we are seemingly, or certainly as mammals, we're definitely designed to respond to the stimulus and to entrain to musical information in a very unique way. And this very early response arises continually in the very nature of musical language. This is, again, only one example of many, many, many that could be used in high art music, which happens to have been the world I spent my life exploring. And this is Haydn, a deeply devout man, as we know, a very wonderful, inspirational man, dedicated every piece he ever wrote with a personal and specific dedication to either Christ or God, or, this was a man of true faith. And when he came to set the 7 last words of Christ on the cross, perhaps the most poignant words are where Christ, crucified, looks down and sees his mother and says, "Mother, behold thy son," and then looking to the disciple says, "Son, behold thy mother," meaning that the relationship should continue but with a different figure. Haydn, I'm sure unconsciously, but very significantly, uses what we now know to be a universal prosodic pre-linguistic interval, which is the mummy interval. Mummy, which anyone who's a parent has heard it, and there was that little song, Danny Cade, for those of us ancient enough to remember, "Mummy, I want to drink of water." It comes up in irrespective of cultural background, the mummy interval. And here, in that very elevated, sacred work, we hear, "Mother, behold thy son." Now, I don't for a moment suggest that all of music is based wholly upon such elements of syntax, but a great deal is. In fact, a good part of it is. That's part of how music creates a universal template of creation and response. If there weren't common elements that we'd all experienced, particularly in our early growth, music couldn't speak to us, it couldn't move us, couldn't change our mood and state. There are a vast number of such illustrations. Now, moving on, of course, there are a number of individuals who, for all sorts of reasons, still many of them not fully understood, find it very difficult or simply don't make the developmental stages which most of us have the good fortune to explore naturally. They unfold in a natural sequence. And as you probably know, it seems that there are what you might call windows of opportunity developmentally that are much harder to recreate when the natural timing has not taken place for whatever reason. It's not to say they can't be recreated, but it's a much harder job. I say all that because I do understand that autism is a spectrum condition that is singularly tricky to define, may cover a multitude of different situations, and is used very often as a sort of blanket term for what can be a very mild or a very difficult situation. Tony de Blois, who you're about to see, was brain damaged during birth, almost certainly by way of oxygen deprivation. At the age of 2, in the interview that I'm going to play a tiny part of, his mother just beforehand was explaining that by the age of 2, this blind child was still unable to sit up, couldn't communicate in any way, and would only respond to any human contact by kicking, biting and screaming. And more or less in desperation, the mum, who happened to be a keyboard teacher, piano teacher, bought a little electronic keyboard and put it by Tony's side and kept leading his hands to the keyboard. And he made what for him was a very significant breakthrough, what for the rest of the family was a bit of a nightmare. He suddenly realized that by banging up and down on the keyboard, he could make noises. And he obviously found that very exciting. And with an energy that the autistic individual so often shows, would hit the keyboard for 23 hours a day. And then she says that she was standing at the kitchen sink one day washing up. And something quite remarkable happened. The most remarkable thing to her immediately was that he stopped playing. There was a long, long silence. And then, in a way that still defies full understanding, although of course I would reiterate, we've all been there and done it, but so early on that we don't remember probably, she said, to her amazement, she heard him picking out the first few notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Now that's a great breakthrough, clearly. It means that inside that child's mind, brain, whatever one wishes to say, extraordinary event had taken place that he realized there was an outside world, there was his inside world, that by making activity he could elicit stimulus, but the key thing was that by refining his activity, he could define the stimulus he received. And of course that is the beginning of everything. It's the beginning of being creative, probably the beginning of being human, and certainly the beginning of a path of infinite reward and development. We see him now a few years later. He had, at the time we met him, I think 10,000 pieces committed to memory. He describes how he memorizes, the envy of just about every musician I've ever met, and certainly far beyond me. And I think the most key part of this little fragment of conversation is that here's a child or an individual who will almost certainly, sadly, never be able to make a sensitive, emotional response to his mother. But he does something in the music which I think is likely to remain forever out of reach at any other level. Do you feel that the music's actually helped him to express himself in ordinary language, for example?
Yes, Yeah, because, well, when he was little, I used to take him outside and we used to sing Autumn Leaves. And we'd go out there and we'd play in the leaves and we'd talk about autumn leaves. When I taught him how to swim, I had him put his head on my shoulder and we'd sing, "Put your head on my shoulder." And
I just demonstrated that.
yeah. And
Excellent.
we'd sing "Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head." And so that he was, all the songs that there were, I was trying to give him meaning for what the words were in songs. Because I felt that the music was the key to Tony and how to work with him. And so it was taking Tony from where he was and using those skills to bring him further along.
You pick up all your music pretty well, though.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Now, why is it so easy for you?
It's a lot of hard work and it takes a while. So I listen to a tune in the library. I just listened to it once.
Yeah.
I listened to a song that's played in the library. Then I went back from the library and then pick it out on the piano and played it.
How do you feel inside yourself now?
Sometimes I feel.
Do you actually have a sound for everything in the world?
Birds. Traffic sound. Siren. Train.
That's beautiful. And do you like making other people feel what you're feeling as well?
Oh, sometimes.
You must have one of the luckiest mums in the world because you give her so much music, don't you?
I know.
I've got a really hard question for you, Tony. Is there anything that you couldn't say in music?
No.
So you could say anything you wanted in
Yeah.
music? Okay. How do you feel about your mum?
I feel happy.
Yeah. How does that sound?
Great.
Could you play it? I wish I could tell my mum how I felt as well as that. Just in passing, and I'll make this very brief, there, as many of you may know, there's now increasing belief that that autism is not in any way an emotional deficit. It's the lack of a need to communicate the emotion, which is in a way even more strange to understand, but it would appear that a great deal goes on inside that simply doesn't come across because the individual feels no need to share it. At least that's one of the thoughts at the moment. One of the very key parts of what we might call, unfortunately we would call perhaps the primitive response, is around the autonomic nervous system. That is heartbeat, breathing, pulse, and a whole set of hormonal responses. And music, as we'll see shortly, can be used most powerfully, and indeed, I think it is used, even in our culture, most powerfully at this level. Of course, we create all sorts of rituals to make what would otherwise be singularly illicit activity, that is, a person or group of people shaping your innermost emotion. It's not surprising that, particularly in England, we have this very strong tradition, in fact, in the sort of Western world generally, a strong tradition of sitting bolt still whilst we'll say how very moved we were. because should we actually ever unleash the true response, the true power of music, it could be overwhelming. And so perhaps the inhibition has a value. But there's a good deal of work. I'm involved in one such, actually, where we've now successfully created a response template from the music directly to brain activity. And we can use the brain activity to select the piece so that the individual is going in whichever direction emotionally they choose to go. And you can then show that it happens because of the feedback loop. It's quite fascinating. Because of the tremendous precocity, the earliness of our musical response, which, as I say again, far precedes language, and because it's happening in utero, even precedes gesture, although it's intimately connected with gesture. And I would draw your attention to Colwyn Trevarthen's beautiful work with mother and baby, neonates and mother, where he's actually created musical scores showing the play, the byplay of movement, gesture, eye contact, the little jokes and little intimate games. And if you create the scores, and this is not an imposition, you do come up with beautiful, formal 8-bar and 16-bar phrases. It's quite fascinating and lovely to watch. It also means that because it's there so early, because of what is sometimes called retrogenesis, that is the likelihood, overwhelming likelihood, that if we suffer loss later in life, the loss tends to work on the old sort of union principle of last in, first out. Sorry to raise that ghastly spectre to you. But our brain works the same way. By and large, and any of you who've had or have elderly relatives, you may even begin to explore it a bit yourself, you'll find that you can often remember things from far back better than what you were doing yesterday afternoon. Well, that's little fragments of retrogenesis. And that's a very important thing for reaching people when in dementia or otherwise lost, as I'll illustrate shortly. Because this extends even to people in coma. Now, the reason I'm sitting to talk to you, and the reason I no longer perform, except very occasionally, is because about 4 or 5 years ago I had a very devastating aortic rupture, which fortunately only afterwards did I discover has a 3% survival rate. I somehow stayed alive. I was very lucky. Was given an opportunity to say goodbye to my family, particularly my daughter, who happens to be sitting down in the front there. Went in for 12 and a half hours surgery. I've seen the operation, not my operation, but the operation since. It's spectacular. I mean, technically, it's simply spectacular, where they pack your brain in ice and give you curare so that everything stops, and that gives them about 38 minutes, I think it is, to do the stuff. They either get it done or you're dead. If they go over that time, then the brain damage begins, and there's nothing they can do. Now, in my case, I was fortunate. I survived the actual operation. They then induce a sedated coma so that you don't die of shock. And the theory is you're meant to come out after about 3 to 5 days. Now, in my case, I chose, of course it wasn't quite as simple as that. I elected to stay in my coma for about 6 weeks, during which time, very untypically, I was experiencing all sorts of things. Mostly things I would strongly recommend you never experience in your life. They were truly horrific. And I'm actually making a radio program about that at the moment, and you may hear a little bit in due course. The only moments of solace, if that's what they were, beauty, were fragments when I would hear a woman's voice singing Indian rags to me. Now, in actual fact, I gather now that what my family were doing, partly because I'd been preaching it for most of my adult life, was they persuaded the surgeons and the doctors to let them play music, and they were playing our recordings. when they found the right track, sure enough, the autonomic system, which I mentioned before, like blood pressure and all of that sort of stuff, responds, even though I was not there and I was in coma. And I'm not alone. I mean, this has now been well established that you can be in a very deep coma and still respond to musical stimulus, to the extent that your level of arousal will go up and down, and they can bring you closer and closer to consciousness or still you. Pain was obviously a major issue for me, and you can lower the pain thresholds quite significantly, which we'll see shortly. Also, apparently the family were doing sing-songs by the bed. God, what was it you used to do? You used to do one of the musicals also. My Fair Lady apparently featured in quite a big way. I didn't hear My Fair Lady. I didn't really see much in the way of My Fair Ladies either. I was in my own hell. But from time to time, this solo female voice of exquisite beauty would come through the morass of horror, singing rags. And I think it was probably when Callista there was doing her scale practice. Now, she does not sing in rags, she does not sing in microtones. Either the drugs I was on distorted the auditory field, that's the kind of reductive theory. My own belief is that because my higher cognitive function was not present, I was hearing music as it actually is, because music actually is a microtonal event that we culturally tune to, particularly to the tempered pitches that have now become the cultural norm. But actually, music doesn't exist in that space at all. And as I say, I had moments of great beauty and exquisite loveliness, but only moments, I'm afraid. But it's just to really reinforce. Now, that might give a slightly different context for what we hopefully will see here. I've lost my little arrow. Oh, there it is. Which is the power of music to move the primitive autonomic nervous system in terms of its level of arousal. And this is someone who I have the highest possible regard for, Ralph Spinker, who's a professor of anesthesiology, anesthetics, is probably the easiest way of saying it. And he uses music in his clinic, as you can see.
Well, the first thing which we see is that we can save sedative drugs for pre-medication. When you take the usual dosage, which is published in a textbook or something like that in anesthesia, you can take half of it in every patient. In anesthesia, and even in my pain clinic, I can work without any sedative drug nowadays. This morning you saw patients who were going to get central nerve blocks, which is an unpleasant procedure, and they don't get a sedative drug for this procedure because they get music. So this is a very important thing for a doctor. But there is something more you can do. You can obviously enhance the motivation of the patients for post-operative rehabilitation exercises. The cooperation, the compliance between patient and therapist is much improved. What we did is we asked the music therapists to design programs which control the level of activity of our patients. We start with a simple melody done by a single instrument, and it's just playing around, a very simple melody. Then we add voices, thus increasing the dynamic range of the piece of music, and this helps the patient to get up, to be more active. Keeps it on a certain level, and then we go back. We take away one voice after the other until we have again the single instrument with a simple melody, and it runs out. And we have even designed it so that it follows exactly the time schedule of that procedure. It's 12 minutes, and that's it. And that works very nice.
This is quite exceptional. But what's the music actually doing? Is it merely distracting the patient, or is it actually tying into some more fundamental system?
I think there are two things. One is, of course, it's a kind of distraction. When you ask especially young people what do you feel when you listen to that music? They say, well, I'm going away from this situation to my discotheque or something like that. At the same time, we have seen that we can significantly reduce the amount of pain experienced by the patients, and we can significantly decrease the level of stress hormones in the blood. By the way, not only with our European patients, but I went to Japan for some time and did the same research with Japanese, which is a completely different cultural background, but it works the same way.
What is it in music that actually works this magic?
This is the decisive question, of course. My feeling is, from all the experience I have, that it might be rhythm, which is the main stimulus, the most important parameter. We are running a research program where we are trying to combine the knowledge in neurophysiology about the rhythmic control of all vital functions with music and rhythm.
I should have warned you it's a bit gory. But it's kind of hard to argue with that, isn't it? Of course, in the music profession, they would say, well, you know, play the poor lady a viola solo, and then she would have... Anyway, that's another story. Suffice it to say that music runs very deep indeed. Now, I daren't get into the philosophy of this because we'd be here an awfully long time and you'd all fall asleep, I know. But it does strike me increasingly that human beings, all of us, we live metaphoric lives. The greatest metaphor of all is language, of course. There's really very little in language which is direct to the experience itself. It's descriptions of, it's interpretations around. One of the great significances of music, but not only music, dance, is that it is a direct way of expressing embodiment, what it is to be embodied, both the joy and the horror of it sometimes. The beautiful thing about music, of course, which is what Mendelssohn said so brilliantly, he was probably about 13 or 14 when he said it, which is that music is too precise to express in words. We saw that with the autistic lad. To play Twinkle Twinkle, because that was actually the greatest gift his mother gave him, is an act of supreme beauty. And music generally is an act of supreme beauty, or can be, and solace and consolation, which is what my great mentor Clifford Curzon said music was for him when I asked him. Idiot that I was in my early 20s. I said, Clifford, what is music for you? And he did me the honour to actually seriously sit and think about it. And he said, music is a consolation. And just to show you how young I was and gauche, I said, for what? And he said, for life, Paul, for life. Just to extend, whilst music may offer all sorts of consolations and internal coherence for the individual during difficult times, which clearly I can speak for, as we've already seen indicated, the arts generally, and of course I would say music in particular, is beautifully geared towards our social and community, the idea of sharing value that cannot and should not perhaps speak its name, as it were. It's far too sensitive, far too intimate to have to be made explicit necessarily, although we do live in a very explicit age, sadly. But, for example, my wife, who actually has a far greater talent for this aspect of things than I ever shall, she's a truly vocational teacher of young children and teaches at the academy as well, has started a project called the Song Trees Project. This is the sort of thing that will be, I'm sure, familiar to you, where she gets children 7 to 11 to interview their grandparents about their earliest musical memories. And then the program helps the children to come and learn those songs or those pieces, either to play them or to sing them. And of course, along the way, a whole family history is unpacked, and the whole family becomes so deeply involved. The concerts are extraordinarily moving, because, to be honest, people who would never ordinarily be seen dead at a concert come full of support for their children, because actually that child is now, as it were, carrying the family history. which is, and nothing is more precious than this feeling that you've invested yourself into your future through your child, through your grandchild. And this is the most beautiful way of doing it. And it's something very lovely. And those sort of aspects of the arts and music are timeless. They become more important the harder times are. And this is not a kindness in a way, but I mean, we can't kid ourselves. This is a very painful time for the arts because it shows up the deficits of the paucity of our cultural values just at the moment, in my view. Thank God it is being held on to, and I rejoice that, and I hope to goodness that it remains true, and it must remain true. But by the grace of God, we'll never get to this pitch. This is friends of mine who smuggled themselves in under the runway into Sarajevo during the siege with a cameraman, and they followed a couple of teenage girls as they tried to live in Sarajevo whilst Milosevic and his thugs surrounded the city and were doing this sadistic bombing. You know, they would slice the side off the hospital, and then when all the patients got out with great difficulty into the grounds, they'd bomb the grounds and so on and so forth. And they were bombing the few remaining water supplies and stuff like that. It was just horrific. It went on for months, of course. And we pick up, it's only a fragment, we pick them up, the story, when they're about to run across the road to take the cameraman and my friend to what they call my place. Now, you'll see them run across the road. You'll hear what, if you're a normal person, or most of us have had an average, comfortable existence, what sound like cars backfiring, but of course there's snipers shooting at them from the high-rise flats. The only way to get to my place, which is an underground club, is by running across the road. And everyone you see there has literally run a gamut of death to go and do what they're doing. And I think what they're doing has an important message for us.
Chetniks are there across the river. We can go just walking because snipers are shooting all the time, and now we have to run.
Now. All right, I am going to go last. Okay.
This is a very amazing place, you know. We lived for last 17.5 months. We lived in, how can I call it, you know, it's not a place, it's actually, you know, some kind of super modern concentration camp, you know, where people actually, they're living death. You understand me? They're actually not living next to death or with the death, but they're living death.
Through these tunnels we will go to our place.
And it's my own certain belief that when the story comes to be told of what's going on in so many Arab cities right now, there'll be equivalents of that going on. People move to music when their need is greatest. I've got just enough time to play a little fragment, if I may. I should have explained, on top of all of that, with the surgery, as is quite typical after such surgery, I suffered a series of strokes and so was paralysed for some months. Thank God, as you can see, I recovered the use of my limbs, largely by trying to play the violin, but it's left me weak, hence the sitting down. This is it's a tiny little piece by Bach, written as a memorial for his first wife, Anna Maria, who died in childbirth. And it's a saraband. A saraband is an erotic, in fact it was banned for a long time because it was considered so erotic, hard to hear that now, dance that became also used as a memorial song or dance when there was a death in theatre or a death in life. Okay, well, thank you. That's really kind. I very generously been given 5 more minutes. So there's two alternatives. If any of you have any questions, I do love questions and I love discussion and debate. Alternatively, there's a little piece that my daughter wrote. She had the misfortune to sit by both my mother's deathbed and her grandmother on the other side in the last few months, and she wrote a little song for her grandma, which is very beautiful. But there must be some things burning. Are there? It's entirely up to you. I'm very happy which way we go. I will try and be around for the rest of the day if I can, energy-wise. If I can, and I'm more than happy to have chats. Yes?
Responses to natural harmonics. I think we call them solfeggio frequencies. And I wanted to ask about concert pitch, in particular 440 hertz. Is it hertz?
Yeah.
And whether our autonomic system or our brain waves respond differently to music played at that pitch to natural harmonics.
Yeah. That's one of those wondrously vexed questions. As you know, what we would call the tuning of instruments has shifted radically over the centuries. And people who play so-called original instruments, which, I mean, they're attempting to recreate, say, the 18th century or before, will nearly always play on a much flatter tuning. The whole system shifts down. It's extremely complex, so complex that I hesitate to dip into it at the moment. But there are some clues. One clue is that it seems increasingly certain, you know, there's this big thing about perfect pitch, you know, big fuss. It seemed overwhelmingly likely that actually all of us are born with what we might call perfect pitch. Each of us has a hardwired response based around specific pitches, particularly of vocalization, because it's key to understanding language and the recognition of who's speaking and the actual nuancing of the language itself, and becomes doubly so when you're in Chinese or something, which are actually pitched languages. How that's shifted given the tuning, we simply don't know. But what most of us do is learn to no longer have perfect pitch, because actually developmentally it's quite helpful not to know the name of the pitch you're hearing unless you happen to be a certain kind of musician. I don't have perfect pitch unless I'm not thinking about it. If I'm not thinking about it and I pick up a violin and I'm miles away, I'll automatically go to the right A as we currently use it. Whether there are what you might call hardwired responses around specific tuning pitch-wise, I think honestly the jury's out at the moment. There are a lot of people trying to find out. What I think is equally, possibly even more important, is how we respond to how music is tuned within the system we have. Because there's a natural tuning, which is the harmonic series, which singers and violinists automatically tune to. That's the natural division of the strings. And they don't tune the same way as we now in the West, since Bach, broadly speaking, have tuned our instruments. Whether that makes a difference in our emotional reception, I suspect that it does. It's very hard to prove, because it becomes like the quality of the air we breathe. Do you see what I mean? It so much surrounds us. How do we separate?
What sparked the thought was that you responded to the scales,
yeah,
not to the music.
Oh no, yeah, but that's a really good question. I think the state I was in, I wasn't conceptualizing anything. I was just experiencing. I was experiencing an alternate set of realities. I hesitate to say they were unrealities. They weren't the realities we normally live in. For example, the first time I heard the music, which was the most beautiful, I was floating in space around a female deity, an Indian female deity, presumably Hindu, with other entities floating around. We were all effectively dead. And I was perfectly happy. I would have been perfectly happy to spend the rest of my universe and life there. It wasn't life. I couldn't think in those things. I would have stayed there forever. But then I tried to get dragged back by these monsters who I now know were doctors. Well, I mean, I'm only saying how it was perceived from inside. But then, you know, if you're in that place, I was presumably heavily sedated, I was on morphine and God knows what, and you're being dragged back to a place where, for a moment, there's a sort of a glimmer that you're in incredible pain and that you might die anyway. Well, why do you want to go back there? I think that's why I spent my 6 weeks where I was, to be honest with you. It was, I won't say it was comfortable, because it was horrible, but it was the times I was being dragged back that I couldn't stand. I was perfectly happy. And incidentally, if it's any comfort to anyone, the actual process of dying for me, I found thoroughly agreeable. No, I mean, I say it because I think it's quite important to know. I know that's not true for everyone, because I have met doctors who've spent time with people with aortic dissections. They say a lot of people panic terribly. I felt perfectly serene. I was told I was likely to die. It was fine. I felt it just didn't touch me at that level. It was the coming back I found very hard, and still do sometimes, to be honest. Anyway, I'm sorry, we've gone off track rather, but I mean, it's a super question, and the real answer is I don't know.
That's why I asked.
Yeah. Damn. Well, you know what? When I started the work I do, which is the whole thing of exploring brain function, it all came because of a question. I'd heard someone give a talk, it's a long time ago, 30 odd years ago, and I asked a question, and it was then about the brain hemispheres, which was the brand new area. And my question was, what could be said about the functioning of the hemispheres with respect to the development of scientific as opposed to musical language? And he made the most wonderful, wonderful response, and I'm tempted to do it now with you. He said, I think that's the most important question. So much so, I would suggest you go and find the answers for yourself.
I've been reading for a long time trying to find the answers.
Yeah. But you'll find there are people out there. A lot of them on the internet, and you have to sift through the wacky to the, you know what I'm saying, but there are some quite serious people doing serious work in exactly that area.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
You can have somebody over here. Stuart can verify with the mic.
Thank you. It's a very, very simple question. I wasn't sure on the term prosodic, if you could explain that.
Prosody is really the vocal, well, it's normally used about the vocalizing, the musicality of the voice as opposed to the words. You know, I mean, there's lots of work going on in this, some fantastic work. Nowadays with computers, they can, for example, remove the verbal element but leave the actual contours of the voice. And of course, the contours largely tell you what's really going on. In the same way as broadly speaking, you'd say it's either the music or the emotion of the voice. Which to me is the larger part of the meaning. So you'll get everything except the actual tangible fact that you're saying. Do you see what I mean? So what I just said was with a softer ending. Well, that could be a musical phrase. And as a human being with a developed language, particularly if the language is a common one, you'll respond to that, you'll recognize it as language, and you'll largely understand hard to say, isn't it? You'll understand the message, but without being able to be precise as to, do you understand what I mean? It's really lovely. It's one of the problems I think there is about, say, emailing. Emailing doesn't have prosody. I mean, I've proposed sometime, and I'm sure it will happen sometime, because I'm not clever enough to do it, that the keyboard should actually be made sensitive enough to respond to the muscle tone you use whilst... Yeah, but then you get something of the gesture behind the language. And those things will happen, by the way. Because remember, it's an infant technology at the moment. We need, as human beings, we're social mammals. I mean, I don't say we're only social mammals, but we're highly sophisticated at reading emotional gesture and the signals of intention. Of course we are, otherwise we couldn't, I mean, can you imagine? you couldn't cohabit, could you? And those rare individuals who are not able to, either because frighteningly they're psychotic and they have certain aspects missing which they can mimic but they don't feel, or they have other deficits, are either dangerous to us, threatening to us, or need an awful lot of help, probably all three. Sorry, I'm waffling on, but...
Thank you. We do have to draw this bit to a close now because there's a lot more to do today. But can I say huge thanks? Sorry, I should be standing near the mic. Absolutely fascinating talk and a hugely, hugely moving one as well. And I'm sure each of us had some very, I don't know, individual but also collective resonances, I think, with what was being said. So thank you very,
Well,
very
thank you.
much indeed.
Thank you.